And now I'd like to invite Bernie Frolic to tell us his journey with China and in China to old friend and new friend.
Okay, thank you all for your kind words. First, yes, it's been a long time for the book, and I apologize. Let me first express my gratitude to York University for giving me the freedom to explore new and exciting ideas in faraway places, so I could tell my students what I saw and learned, how countries developed and are governed, and to publish books like this one that we're discussing today. My thanks also to the four panelists. Uh, one is going to be up there on the screen, uh, who together have almost 200 years of China experience, 200 years. And to those of you here today who made the pilgrimage to York. Okay, my book is about how Canada developed links with China over 50 years. I never thought that China would encompass most of my life's work. It was not my intended career choice. Actually, that was the Soviet Union. York hired me in 1966 to teach Soviet politics. I had just spent a year in Moscow doing my PhD research on Soviet city government when I also happened to make my first trip to China. I continued to study both China and Russia until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Back in 1965, it was the midst of the Cold War, and I wanted to get a firsthand view of how these two big communist systems worked in practice. So when I was in Siberia, after my year in Moscow, I took the train from Irkutsk to Peking and spent a month in China. Thus began my China journey. In the next 50 plus years, I made 60 more visits, living there, teaching their students, with a brief stint as a Canadian diplomat during the Cultural Revolution, and training Chinese officials, educators, and executives in China and Canada. Back and forth between Moscow and Peking, or Beijing as we now call it, comparing the two communist systems and studying Sino-Soviet relations until there was no more Soviet Union, just a China that today has become a superpower competing with the Americans. In 1965, China was very poor. Over 80% of its almost 700 million population was living below the UN official poverty line, less than $1.50 a day. Few foreigners were there, a handful of Canadians, probably half a dozen of us. We had no diplomatic relations. They knew almost nothing about Canada, and China was about to experience the 10 years of Cultural Revolution when its political system was on the brink of collapse. Why did I write this book? I wrote this book to provide an authoritative record of how Ottawa developed relations with China, beginning with recognition in 1970. The book focuses on 10 decisions or stories, 10 moments of decision that describe how Ottawa made China policy. Those stories focus on the following: the 2 years of negotiations for recognition back in 68, 70, establishing the One China policy, which led to uh, uh, ending relations with Taiwan, uh, creating a development assistance program in China, developing a China trade strategy, the Tiananmen crisis, which changed a lot, imposing sanctions on China, Prime Minister Chrétien's 1994 Team Canada trade mission, a decade of failed human rights policy, and the Harper and Justin Trudeau responses to our changing relationship with China. I've interviewed over 100 Canadian and Chinese officials, including 5 prime ministers, 20 ministers, all of our 16 ambassadors, and 50 foreign service officers, and I had access to government files, many of which are still closed. The book also draws on my personal diary, of which there are 30 excerpts in the book. An historical overview. After the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976, China opened up and seemed ready to liberalize. Trade blossomed, and there was a modest program in human rights. The two sides spoke also of having a special relationship. Then in 1989, the world watched as Chinese troops killed hundreds of their own citizens by or at Tiananmen Square. China had reverted to authoritarianism to stave off possible regime collapse. Canada imposed sanctions and strongly criticized China's human rights abuses. After 4 years, relations were repaired, though not at pre-1989 levels. Trade became the main focus under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. This period ended when Prime Minister Harper took power in 2015. He pledged to reset relations, but by 2020, they were at the lowest level. He treated China as an adversary. I got a little bit mixed up here. With human rights a priority. That's Harper. By 2009, he reversed course and focused on trade. Then relations struggled as both sides re-examined their positions. When Justin Trudeau became prime minister in 2015, he pledged to reset relations. But by 2020, they were at the lowest point in 50 years. With Chinese hostage taking, the banning of key Canadian exports, Chinese, what we call wolf warrior diplomacy, aggressive kind of diplomacy, and shrinking relations. We are currently in this period waiting to see what will happen, when relations can be reset, if not back to the mid-90s, then at least to the mid-Harper years. What is our China strategy? What has it been? At the beginning, we followed Pierre Trudeau's vision to open China up to the outside world. Don't isolate 700 million people from international institutions and values. Yes, it was the Cold War and China was communist, but with engagement and economic development, China could liberalize politically by what was then called the theory of peaceful evolution. Modernization would bring forth economic development, and that would lead to more democratic practices and more liberalism. Tiananmen changed the discourse. Political liberalization wasn't happening, and we turned to trade, education, and people-to-people links as the best strategy for maintaining our relationship. I never saw a document in the files saying this is the Canadian-China strategy, although how to deal with China was always an issue. There were those in Ottawa who believed we must treat China as an authoritarian communist system, and those who thought it could be detached from its authoritarianism with time and closer engagement. The search for a better Canadian-China strategy has never ended, and today this remains a major issue for Canadians. The American elephant. Pierre Trudeau famously said, as we know, relations with America are like sleeping with an elephant. You have to be aware of every twitch and grunt of the beast. That American elephant has always been tied to our China policy. We differed from the Americans a few times when we established diplomatic relations in 1970, despite American objections, when we sacrificed diplomatic relations with Taiwan, when we adopted our one China policy at the time. In the recent period, US protectionism and anti-China policies have negatively affected our relations with China. We often talked about, quote, being ahead of the Americans, unquote, and being independent from US policy, even as we remained close allies. But Zhou Enlai once said, Canada has a semi-independent foreign policy. I think that was an apt analysis. In the future, our China policy will likely go through Washington, an unpleasant truth for many Canadians. Can or should Canada have an independent China policy? And will Peking or Beijing always see us as an appendage of the Americans? Future relations. It's impossible not to have relations with China. It's too big, too important in the world. For example, too important for Canadian trade. We do over $100 billion worth of two-way trade annually. for our higher educational system. Nearly 200,000 international students are here from the PRC. Too vital for our 2 million Canadian ethnic Chinese who have so many ties with families and in China. In the book, I suggest we pursue a two-level strategy. Focus on the areas that we have of positive cooperation. That is trade, education, people-to-people links, and collaboration on international multilateral issues such as disarmament, global warming, and anti-terrorism, when we may have an impact. When China is violating Canadian sovereignty by forcibly retrieving Chinese individuals in their fox hunts, setting up PRC police stations in our Chinese communities, or continuing to steal access to our intellectual property, and when they ban Canadian exports for political reasons, and of course hostage taking, then we have to be tougher and retaliate when necessary. We can discuss what that means. We have not been doing enough of that. We do continue to deal with the human rights issue, and we should always continue to talk about Canadian values, whether we have an effective voice in China or not. To conclude, let me read what I wrote on the last page of my book. It was a final note in my diary. Understanding China is an elusive concept. Caught up in our own cultural values and ideology, we do not often, quote, get China right, unquote. After 50 years, China does not always behave in the way that we expected. Do we have the inclination and the resources to find a better way to deal with this emergent superpower? That is our challenge. Will I return once more? People have asked me that. It would be the 62nd trip. Maybe I've reached the end of a great journey that began in 1965. Learning about China and our relations with its government and its people has been as much a voyage in understanding my own culture and values as it was in learning about China. And for that, I am truly grateful. So thank you very much.